Dang it.
Hi, Bob Canote, Camp Chaos Chronicles, and I'm coming to you today in my role as President, CEO, CFO, and all those other things of JaguarPreserve.com. And this is going to be a product review and a bit of an explanation as to why you actually need one of these things. Now, what we're going to be looking at is one of these. This is the part that comes off the front end of your crankshaft, and I actually just pulled this one off the front of a used engine. The front part of this, being oriented like this on the engine, is just a pulley that is used to drive power steering and alternator and that sort of thing. What we're really talking about here is this part right here, and this is called either a harmonic balancer or a harmonic damper. Now, I prefer the term harmonic damper because balancer gives the impression that this is going to have something to do with the internal balance of the engine. And what that is you got a lot of stuff rotating around on the inside of the engine, crankshaft, connecting rods, pistons, and that sort of thing. And these things have to be balanced very carefully in order to prevent excessive vibration in the engine. Okay, and that's important. But what this thing actually does is it deals with torsional deflections of the crankshaft caused by the different forces being imparted to it. And let's take a look at what that means. Now, my assumption here is that the person that's listening to this has a bit of an understanding of how an engine works, so I'm not going to go through the four-stroke cycle theory. Just suffice it to say that what we've got here is a crankshaft out of a 5.3 liter Jaguar V-12, and you can see that it's spinning on these journals right here. These are called main journals, and the connecting rods and the pistons attach to these offset journals, which are called the crank pins. The engine, the Jaguar V-12 engine, is very finely balanced at the factory. So the internal balancing as far as weight is concerned is not a problem. What is a problem, though, is that you've got a lot of forces acting on a crankshaft other than just weight imbalance. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at this crank pin right here. And let's imagine that we got a connecting rod and a piston that are being forced downward by combustion. Spark plug ignites fuel and air mixture, and you get the hot expanding gases pushing on the piston, which is pushing this crank pin downward. Not a big deal so far. The problem arises in back here, and I'm guessing that this is the crank pin where this phenomenon is actually going to be happening on, but let's just sort of use the worst case scenario where we got this one back here, way back in the engine, that is coming up under compression. Okay, so what you've got is two conflicting forces. You got this one coming down under power, you got this one coming up under compression. So you got power going in, and you got a load of compression fighting it. So what you have then is a twisting moment on the crankshaft. Now, this is a very heavy crankshaft. It's got crank pin journals that are the same size as the 460 cubic inch Ford truck engine. So it's very stiff, but you got to also understand that it's very long. And the longer that a crankshaft is, the worse this twisting moment is going to be. And when you get up to 16-cylinder and 18-cylinder engines like I had back in the day, you can see where crankshaft issues might have been a problem. Not only is it twisting it, but also, being that it's twisting it a little bit, it can also take and drive the main journals out of alignment. So what you want to do is to find a way to minimize that phenomenon. And that's what these things are for. Now, this Harmonic Dampener has a hub on the inside, and it has, and I've got it in white here, it has a rubber material that's been pressed in between this hub on the inside and the pulley on the outside. So what happens here? Well, what happens is under power, the hub is driven this way, and due to the rubber layer in between the hub and the pulley on the outside, you get a little bit of a lag on the outside pulley. So this surges ahead and this kind of lags behind. But the energy that's stored in this rubber, when the piston is no longer being pushed on by the combustion gases, this relaxes and the outer hub catches up and overshoots a little bit. So what you get is a motion like this in between the inner and the outer hub, and it's that motion that is caused by the rubber, and it's also that energy is stored in the rubber as well as the outer hub. So in that way, the torsional deflection issue is mitigated. Now the problem with these is that over time, this rubber can start to wear out. Because you got to remember that this is happening on a V-12 engine every 60 degrees. So there's a lot going on with this thing right here. Over time, what can happen is this can start to deteriorate to the point where you can start to get slippage. And there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, if this thing is slipping instead of doing its job, you're not getting the dampening effect that you need. Now what can happen then? Well, what can happen is that even though this is a really, really stout crankshaft, these things can actually crack and break. And it doesn't take long after this thing starts to fail for that to happen. Other thing that can happen is you got an oil pump that's right on the front of the crankshaft. The gears, the inner gear on that can start to fail for the same reason. And of course, once your oil pump fails, it's over. So nothing good happens when this thing starts to slip. And you can't really grab this thing with your hand and try to twist it and see if it'll move. The worst case scenario, of course, is that the outer hub just falls off the engine, and then pretty easy to see you got a problem. The other thing that can happen when this thing starts to slip is that this contains your timing marks. And if you look right here, probably not real easy to see, you can see A with a little index mark right there. And also out here, well, it's not real obvious, you can see the index, but there's an A there as well. Okay? If that starts slipping, then it's impossible to properly time your engine. So it's my recommendation that when you overhaul your engine, this is going to cost you less than $200. To have this replaced. And let's take a look at what that looks like. So when we have these rebuilt, what happens is the hub is pressed out of the pulley, and it is indexed in a position where it would be originally from the factory, the inner hub relative to the outer pulley. And then instead of pressing a material in between the two parts, there is a rubberized elastomer material that is cast into the cavity between the parts. And it's not real obvious there, but you can see concentric circles. That's the elastomer material. In addition to that, the person that I have overhaul these installs a staple in between the two parts. And what this does is it enables any static that is being generated by the belts running on the pulleys to be dissipated through ground back to the battery. And this is important because if you don't do this, this will interfere with your electronics. The first thing we want to do is, well, first of all, let's take a look at how this is situated on the end of the crankshaft. There's a couple of things in here that are stacked on before we put the dampener on. You've got the drive sprocket for the oil pump. You got a collar here that fits on the inside of the seal. And what happens here is this key right here fits in the keyway of this cone. And this cone is like a collet on a milling machine. It's tapered and it's got some slots cut in it. And so when you put it on here, and it fits up against these two parts, these two collars that are inside here, and then you put this harmonic dampener on here. You got a keyway in here, and you got a key right there. These fit on like this, and then now remember, you've got these two parts in here that this is going to butt up against. At this point then you put the big nut on the end and you torque this to, I believe it's 150 foot-pounds. Okay, so what you do is you take, if you're removing this, you take the big bolt off the end. Usually all it takes is just a plastic hammer, a few taps with that. That'll break the joint in between this cone and the taper on the inside of the dampener. And then this can be, because you got the front cover on here, you can take a couple of pry bars and just pull this off. Okay, so what are some things that you should be able to see that tell you whether you got a good dampener or not? Well, first of all, here's the key that drives the dampener. Okay, you should have to take a hammer and a punch and gently tap that out to get it out of the groove before you send your crankshaft in to be reconditioned. So as long as that's tight, you can almost be assured that this keyway in the inside diameter of the taper of the cone is good as well. Because if there's any relative motion between the two, they're both going to suffer because of it. And you can take a look at the sides of the key, and if there's a step, once you remove this, and if there's any kind of a step in between this part and the part that's in the crankshaft, that might be an issue. It all depends on whether when you put this thing on, there's any relative motion between the two parts. Then what we need to do is we need to look at the outside surface of the cone. And what we shouldn't see is a lot of chatter or any chatter marks on here from the dampener, the taper in the dampener and the outside of the cone moving back and forth. We also don't want to see a lot of corrosion and pits, which occurs in northern climates where you got a lot of salt water on the roads in the wintertime, and it gets in here and it just eats this stuff up. Particularly common in engines that have not had this bolt torqued properly. If you just take and bang this on with an impact and assume that's good enough, it's not. You got to have 150 foot-pounds, or I believe that's what the torque is, securing this to the front of the engine. Now, if you look at this white ring right here, you pull your dampener off, and you should actually be able to take your thumb and sink it in here and get some sort of deflection on it. If you see these cracks, as we see right here, and if we look really, really close, we can see smaller cracks in the surface. This material is getting really, really hard. Now, there are some good ones out there used. These are on engines that have been stored inside, that have been taken care of. There hasn't been a lot of grease on the inside. If you got a bad main seal on the front of your crankshaft and you're getting oil on here, that oil can cause that material to deteriorate very rapidly as well. If you're missing chunks, that's a dead giveaway that you've got a dampener that's getting ready to let go. So, as long as this surface, the outside surface and inside surface of the cone are good, send these things into us. We will accept them as a core because we recondition these. We don't have access to any new parts, and we'll shoot one right back to you. The problem arises when you do have those problems I described on these parts. Then we're going to give you a ring and find out what you want to do. We do have some of these that are rebuildable cores that we can utilize, but you know, these things are kind of getting few and far between, like a lot of this Jaguar V-12 stuff. So there you go. That's one of the things we do. Go to our website, jaguarpreserve.com, and take a look at what we offer. I think you'll be impressed with the stuff that we offer you there. And this is Bob Canote, Camp Chaos Chronicles, coming to you for jaguarpreserve.com. See you next time.